Hello and welcome to RP-0 America. So we've got a new craft on the pad here, on pad Alpha, and we're just about at our Mars window as estimated by KSP. Still on the older version of Kerbal. Still need to put a little time aside to see what's updated and what hasn't. Anyway, so we've got we're approaching the Gemini technology, which is awesome. And we've got a craft ready to go to Mars. So it was a pretty expensive craft. Here, let me load it up. Launch. It cost about 30,000 units, and which was roughly 3 times what a lot of the other craft takes. Therefore, it took like 3 times as long to construct, which I wasn't expecting. But hey, you live and you learn. So I had to spend some cash on upgrading the launch pad for that. So planning ahead is valuable, very important. So let's see. Yeah, I'm looking forward to building craft with the Gemini technology. Because then we can really get our crewed program underway. We can do some long duration in Earth orbit. Meanwhile, we're going to try to throw a novel payload at Mars with a novel rocket. So it's not going to be cutting edge payload, in part because the launcher is pretty much untested. I haven't had a chance to, in part there's no real missions that we have or need. Sorry, it's being a little weird. There we go. It's finally loading up. There's no real missions that call for this type of rocket right now. Particularly because we don't have any crewed missions ready to go. It's a huge rocket. See, it's about 500 tons, so it's more than twice as heavy as even my other, my heaviest, my Agathorn lunar lander. It uses that same engine that we were using before. Let's see, we've got 2. We were using 2 of them, and now we're using 8 in a cluster. So it's a pretty impressive set, and we've got a bit of data on it already. Let's see, let's get down to that. Yeah, we've got about halfway to max data, so the core stage should be fairly reliable. The first stage, it's got 8 engines, so statistically, you balance, yes, the engines are reliable with the fact that 8, we're kind of hoping for 8 of them to run perfectly the whole time. And the upper stage is very novel. It's a new stage. It's modeled after the S14 stage, the Saturn stage that used a bunch of RL10s. And those engines aren't too reliable yet. So that's why I didn't try to make it a cutting edge craft, because realistically a lot of things could fail. And the payload ultimately also has, it's this big, pretty substantial sized payload up there. All right, so let's target this. We'd like to kind of be in the plane of the moon, at least vaguely. And I've done a few test flights. Some succeeded, some failed. Let's see, Atlas score. Yeah, I think, let's see, set as target. I'm pretty sure that one's pretty close to the plane of the moon. So see, we're about 6 degrees off. Set as target, 7. Yeah, pretty close to that. Good. So the reason I've called this craft cluster, cluster stand, is because this stage, the Saturn 1 or Saturn IB stage, right now I'm using it kind of as a Saturn 1 because I'll describe it a bit more as it goes up. We're a little past that. That's all right. So let's just warp around to the next window, make sure we're not losing any fuel. Good, things. So it's a weird looking tank compared to really any other tank we use. And the reason is it's a big Juno tank, like the kind of a redstone, it's a really big core tank, and it's 8 smaller tanks around the edge, and it's using basically this was kind of assembled kind of as a rush job to get everything together to start building these really big scaled rockets to prepare for the moon program, because the Saturn 1 wasn't used to send people into orbit, and it wasn't used to send anything to the moon, but it was kind of a precursor, used for precursor missions to kind of get used to both building and flying really large rockets. There, close enough. All right. So is this where is the sun? Looks like it's a dawn. Yeah, pretty close to a dawn launch, I think. Oh, the water might have disappeared, which is a little weird. Oh no, I'm just blind. It's been a little while since I've flown a rocket. All right, let me just brighten up my screen a little bit. There we go. And we're set up. All right, we're set up for launch. So let's see if we can kind of vaguely get into the plane of the ecliptic here. Okay. So we're trying to light all 8 engines there. It looks like they ignited successfully. Excellent. And let's separate. We've got a not too bad, oh, let's just pop that out of the way. We've got a not too bad thrust to weight ratio here. So effectively this core tank is made up of 9 tanks, 8 smaller ones around the outside and 1 large tank in the middle, with 8 engines attached at the bottom. Now this is, we used 2 of these engines before, like I said, and historically one of these is kind of like the engine used in a, very similar, along the same family lineage as the engine used in the Thor. And it's, it's a good all-American engine, not too efficient, not terribly high thrust, but, fairly reliable kerosene LOX burning engine. Pretty good, very good for a first stage. They still used kerosene and liquid oxygen when they scaled up. You started using the F1 engine in the for the full Saturn V. Okay, so we're arced over just a little bit. Yeah, they built this rocket, particularly the first stage, is just kind of thrown together with what, rather than waiting, they wanted to build a large rocket to regally catch up and overtake the Russians in terms of lift capacity. And the best way to do that was to more or less just scale up with the existing technology, but not scale up hugely, because they were using pretty similar to the same engine they were using. They went to the H1, they call it the H1 engine, but if you look at the specs, it's very similar to the engine we were using as the Thor main engine, as I said, and even relatively similar to the ones used for the sustainers for Atlas. Not the sustainer, the booster engines, the 2 side ones, and there's two nozzle version. I don't recall if it shares turbo machinery or not. So technically, like a 2 nozzle single engine type used in the Titan 1 and the Titan 2. I don't recall exactly how similar it is, but you can start to see that family diverging, because the engine, the fuel, say the Titan 2 uses a different fuel, but again, similar chamber pressure, same engine size, very similar thrust range, etc. But it's ultimately you've scaled up in size. So the technology, the engines are similar, but first time I'm aware that the U.S. was clustering so many engines, and so it was kind of a lot of design, engineering, all kinds of work. So it was novel in different ways than you might expect new rocket designs to be, because they're clustering so many engines just to see, is clustering lots of engines a serious option for putting more payload out into low Earth orbit and ultimately towards the moon or not. Okay, so we're going pretty fast. Probably arced a little higher than I need to be, but that's okay. This craft, I find it's really forgiving. It's just the way I've designed it. I don't know. On one hand, it's fun to design payloads that are really at the edge of the capacity of your craft. But on the other hand, if an engine could fail, or you might get an ignition wrong or something like that. Oh, a little more science there. Then it's good to have margin built in, kind of growing to accept that. So we've burned through most of the mass of this craft, and we're really lobbing in a pretty high trajectory. So let me just arc down. And I want you to keep an eye on the G-forces as well. We're going to hit some pretty substantial G-forces. Now, that hadn't been a problem on any of my previous missions, my previous tests with this craft, because engines just were failing during the tests. Looks like this time we're getting pretty lucky. In theory, I could shut down. That's one advantage of having a large cluster of engines, is if you want to be kind of more realistic and historic and limit the G-forces, you could just manually shut off the engines or set up action groups to shut some of them off. In practice, failures were doing that for me before, which was kind of nice. Ultimately, you probably you don't want your, say, first stage to push your astronauts beyond, like, say, 4.5 to 5 Gs or so. Here we go. So we have first stage burnout here, and we're moving pretty fast. We've got a pretty high lob, so let us first drop off the first stage. We've got retro solids there, pull it off, and then we've got forward solids to ullage the fuel. Just a little nudge of G-force to make sure the fuel is settled and stable. and it looks happy, very stable fuel. All right, and we have 6-engine ignition here. This is, of course, because these are the engines I have less reliability with, and it's a good time to drop off the fairing as well. They're the ones I've had more trouble with. I've had a number of different failures, but see here it's another cluster as well. Just like the Centaur, where I was showing off the birth of liquid hydrogen engine technology. Here we've got the same type of engine. I think it's even the same model, similar thrust, very high specific impulse, but it's this big balloony tank, not an actual balloon tank, I don't believe, but it's this big, very high volume tank, and it's a huge upper stage, right? This is even from our previous craft. Like I said, this is at least twice as heavy as our previous craft. Any of our previous things, even the ones with solid boosters. So there's a lot we could do with this stage, as they did historically. The Saturn I led on to an even larger upper stage, Saturn 1B, Saturn IB. So we've got a cluster of 6 engines instead of the 2 that were used on the Centaur. And as far as I'm aware, that's the most RL-10s that have been used on a stage ever. The Centaur uses 2. Some of the modern Centaurs use just one RL-10 instead. And the SLS, the big beefy upper stage, will have 4 RL-10s, which will be quite the sight to see. Of course, with nozzle extensions and even more efficient than these. So yeah, this is our huge craft. It's like really thinking about that the first stage lobbed this puppy up into space with like more than 50 tons of mass was lobbed. It's truly a large craft. If you look back at craft, we were flying not that long ago in RP-0 America, like the Thor craft. The whole craft was on the order of 50 to 100 tons and at the ground. And here you've lobbed it a substantial portion of the way to orbital velocity before even lighting the stage, which is 50 tons. So it's truly a step up in scale, which is why it's really bleeding edge. It's a really interesting historical rocket to study, the Saturn I, as well as the Saturn 1B. Let's see. So we're gathering good data on these engines, which is great because we'd love to use more liquid hydrogen engines. The thing is, liquid hydrogen technology is liquid hydrogen handling, and the tanks and everything are somewhat expensive. So that's why this craft was both much more massive than any of my previous craft, as well as much more expensive. And a more expensive craft in RP-0 means Kerbal construction time will cause it to take longer to build. So my craft up here isn't too novel, although I've done some tests with it. It's very similar to the craft we used for previous flybys, but I've also attached a bit of extra avionics for extra mass, because we've got a little more mass in it, and it has some parachutes in there we can't quite see yet, but I'll show those off once we really reach orbit. I can probably arc a little further down. So this craft, I think we did lose an engine or two while I was gabbing away. All right. So I should probably let MechJeb handle this because it's going to be better at adjusting pitch for the fact that we've lost some engines. So let's take a quick look at them. So here's a good operating engine. That's how much thrust, specific impulse. Now this one, less thrust and less specific impulse. So we're approaching 1 G of thrust, which is a pretty substantial amount of thrust for this. We started really low. It would have been kind of difficult for the mission to continue if we'd lost an engine earlier on, quite early on. But at this point, we're okay, dropping some engines. Also, with these failures, I think MechJeb will report some of this information a little inaccurately. And there we go. So see, we've still got high specific impulse on this one. This engine failed. And it's interesting, they actually failed symmetrically. See, the 2 that failed are symmetrically opposite. So these other 4 can act as if those 2 weren't even on, and the thrust from those 4 will still be nice and balanced. So see, this is why I didn't want it to be a bleeding edge mission, because I will arc a little higher now because we have a much lower thrust-weight ratio than we had started with, than we would have normally expected to have at this point. But that's okay. So let me just get a quick measure of our relative inclination again. Good enough. We've got a lot of extra delta V in this craft as long as we use it. Like as note, kind of keep a look at the speed here, how much delta V we have left in this stage. We've got plenty of delta V to reach orbit, but losing some engines will cause us to burn a bit more delta V, to need a bit more of that delta V to reach orbit. Let's arc just a bit up. Yeah, because we've really lost thrust to weight ratio. Normally we'd expect to be, cresting thrust to weight ratio of 1, and this craft, because the payload isn't too huge, actually gets to a pretty high thrust to weight ratio around burnout, particularly if you burn through all the delta V left in this stage. So while this is going, let's see. So it's a really novel upper stage. The Centaur was it was a balloon tank of liquid hydrogen with oxygen, not particularly intensely insulated. And this is similar, but much larger. So again, the Saturn I is an exercise in scaling everything, scaling up, but not the engines. Using the same engines that were already being developed for the Centaur. Pretty similar to that. And it's interesting the choices they made in trying to to design everything for the space program so quickly in such a short time. They made some difficult choices. Like, you'll notice the efficiency of this isn't terribly high, like relative to say some modern liquid hydrogen burning engines. So they would have like a nozzle extension, which gives them better push, and they would also have higher chamber pressures. So you can get to 450 or 460 specific impulse, seconds of specific impulse. Okay, so we're approaching. See, that's a good thing about us lobbing it. Like, ultimately, we don't need to be in this high of a parking orbit, so we'll be okay if we hit apoapsis. Basically when this gets to 0, whatever number this shows is what we're actually going to be at, and then we're going to start falling. And 320 kilometers it's fine for a parking orbit. It's in fact just a little higher than I usually go for. But I did that a little intentionally, not fully intentionally, but somewhat for this mission, because it's better if you know that some engines are much more likely to fail, to arc a little higher than would be an optimal trajectory, which makes it even more difficult and interesting to design a flight computer to automatically pilot a rocket when you have test flight on. So you want it to detect engine failures and kind of recalculate its ideal trajectory, accounting for those failures. So the Saturn I was mostly used for this. In terms of practical missions, there weren't many with it. Even the first Saturn I flights didn't have an active upper stage. They literally just had a ballast tank full of water to kind of test the ballistics, make sure the rocket would fly as designed and engineered. But they didn't have this stage designed for the first test flights of this, which were done in late 1960 or 1961 and 62. It took many years of testing, of design, build and fly of various versions of the Saturn I. And then they flew some pretty heavy low Earth orbit payloads called the Pegasus, which I believe were micrometeorite experiments. Whereas what I'm doing here is definitely a bit more novel than that. I'm throwing kind of the heaviest payload I've ever thrown at Mars, but really because there aren't too many contracts or terribly interesting, in my opinion, things to do in low Earth orbit. This is what I'd prefer to do with my test mission for this. And if it failed, it failed. That's the nice thing about doing test missions unmanned, like the Americans did with Pegasus, and I'm doing with this. Okay, so let's see. So we're coming down. Yeah, it looks like. So let's just speed up video a little bit, or the launch, not the video. I do no editing, for good or for bad. If something went horribly wrong at this point, I'd probably just post it, go with the video. But if something goes terribly wrong early in the video, or I made a super dumb mistake, I just fix it and start over from scratch and don't post a failed video. I still find it easier than putting in the effort to edit. Okay, so we're starting to come back up. So we're no longer falling faster. We're bringing that towards 0, which is what we want. We want to level off. Gives us just more control of our final altitudes. And yeah, I've clicked too much, and the relative inclination has gone away. But because this isn't a low margin vehicle, unfortunately means it's a little less realistic, because real vehicles it makes sense to put the money and time. Oh, I think we've had another engine failure. Yep, you saw it jerk there, and we're getting more failures. Oh, and you know why we're getting these failures? It's because with those previous engines failing, these other engines are going beyond their rated burn times. Oh, and so let's shut those down. Right, so keep that in mind. These engines have limited rated burn times. And this is actually the worst failure I've had with this test craft so far, even though I did 2 or 3 tests kind of to get myself back into using KSP, etc. But we didn't quite reach orbit with this stage, which is just a little troubling, but it may not scuttle the mission. So we've had tons of engine failures, so let's just dump. Let me just think for a moment, even though we're falling. Let me try to stop it spinning when we're pointed forwards by being a cheater. And there we go, time warp to kill the spin. Okay, so we're still pointed forward. Now what if we can turn, let's say activate the various, let's see, the engines we shut down earlier, because they technically didn't reach the end of their burn time. I'm not quite sure how all of that is managed, but let's first, okay, make sure the fuel is stable, a little bit of forward RCS. The RCS might actually be hidden in there, but okay, let's try to light those engines again. And, oh, causing it to spin pretty bad. Yeah, it looks like we don't quite have, so the engines just can't quite gimbal enough in order to, no, shut that down. I actually almost accidentally hit space there. The engines can't quite gimbal enough to deal with all the ones that have failed, so let's just kill that spin by cheating again. So keep that in mind. If too many engines fail, in part you can make up for that by burning longer, but by burning longer you actually end up potentially exceeding the rated burn time of the engines. So let's just dump that stage because it's not doing us any good anymore. And we've got this beautiful engine. Something I was going to mention is those engines had multiple restarts, which is why I was finding this vehicle to be even more forgiving than really anything I'd ever flown before, which was just really great. There we go. And this vehicle, this portion of it has such a high thrust-weight ratio that we should have no trouble canceling out this fall. Unfortunately, it may not leave us with enough delta V to carry out the mission as hoped for, but you never know. Because the way I designed and tested this, we in theory would have had enough delta V where some of the delta V in that, we would have reached orbit, and we could have used some of the fuel in that to actually start the first push towards Mars. So we would have had tons of fuel left in this, but in designing things as I did, we still may be able to carry out the mission. Although it's hard to say because we've got kind of this delta V issue here. That's roughly how much we're going to need. Yeah, so we're not going to have that amount of delta V in this core stage anymore, unfortunately. So I don't think we're going to be able to carry it out, but I'll do some calculations and kind of check things out in a little bit here. And we definitely don't have enough time to build another craft and get it to the pad for this Mars window, because we're right at the Mars window now. And I don't keep spare craft because, well, I don't have spare cash. Alright, so we're pretty much leveled out. Like we've got the vertical speed fairly close to 0. Okay. And so we have achieved orbit. So we could potentially throw this at the moon and various things, but we've got enough delta V for that, but not enough to get it to Mars. So because that shows the issues with designing a craft in that manner. So we've achieved orbit and a pretty good amount of payload mass, not as quite as much as we would have if that second stage had behaved better. But hey, we've got more reliable RL-10s now, and this payload still was shown to be sound. We were still able to achieve orbit, and we could still do a number of things with this. But technically, to be honest, I think what I'm going to do is cheat some fuel back into this and still throw it at Mars because I find that more interesting. Because I currently don't have the time to, time in game here to throw something up, to build a new thing to throw at Mars before the Mars window. And we're pretty much at the Mars window now. So if I just throw a little bit more fuel into this, basically, put back some of the fuel we used, and we've still got tons of ignitions in this. This thing, it doesn't require ullage. This version of the engine I have. Unlocked some more technology. It's got tons of ignitions. It doesn't require ullage. It's a really solid, it's a really great engine. Not as high efficiency as the ones we've dropped off there. But yeah, so I think I'm going to throw some more fuel into this and then toss it towards Mars. So, yeah. Sorry if that bothers you. not the best player by any stretch of the imagination, but in practice I still really kind of want to test out this payload, and so that's what I intend to do. Thanks for watching RP-0 America. This has been a fairly unsuccessful launch of the cluster's last stand Saturn 1 craft with this payload in orbit destined for Mars. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.